Hello, story lovers. In today's chapter, we're going to go over 5 tips for writing your first story. Grab your pen and favorite cup of coffee. Let's dive in. So my first tip is read. May seem obvious, but a lot of beginning writers don't read as much as they should. Not only should you read as often as possible, but you should read outside of your genre that you tend to write in. So for example, let's say you write horror, like I tend to write a lot of horror. If you're only reading horror, you can fall into the trap of being bogged down into the tropes. Let's say that you want to add more dimension to your stories. You want to borrow techniques that are not necessarily prevalent in your genre. So let's say that you have a horror story that you're writing and you're reading a romance novel. What can you take from the romance novel and apply to your horror story? I think that reading outside of your genre is a really good way to mix and match your tropes to help add something new or deeper into your stories. Furthermore, when you're reading, pay attention to what the writer is doing as you're reading. How are they using dialogue? How are they using exposition? We're going to go into this in a little bit more detail in future videos, but what are they doing and how are they doing it? What are their transitions looking like? Transitions being those moments that take you from one element to another element. So let's say that you're in scene where somebody is actively doing something and then you want to go into a flashback. What does the author do? What technique do they use to smoothly take the reader from in the moment to in the mind, past tense, going into the past? Additionally, have a notebook with you when you read. Quite often, what I find happens for me is I'm reading a story and then a paragraph in, a page in, 10 pages in, something pops into my mind and I go, ooh, I got a great bit of dialogue. Ooh, I got a great character. Ooh, great story concept. And so I'll take out my notebook, I'll write it down, make a couple of notes, and then put it aside and get back to reading. Otherwise, we tend to fall into two different consequences. We're reading, something happens, we go, ooh, I got a great idea. And then we either keep reading and then completely forget about what we were thinking, or put the book aside and go, I gotta write this. And then if we keep on doing that, we end up never being able to finish the story that we're reading. So have a notebook, write down your thoughts, continue reading, and then when you have a good spot where you want to stop reading for a while, go ahead and start writing. Tip number 2 is characters. At some point in the early process of writing your story, you're going to want to have a fairly good idea of just who at least your main character is. When it comes down to it, characters are the life force of your story. If you take your character out of the story doesn't really happen. So you want to really map down who is Janice, what is her biggest fear, what does she do on her days out, what are her likes, her dislikes, what does she want out of life. You know, not all of these things are going to make it into your story. But the more you know about your character, the better you're going to be at knowing how she's going to react when you throw things into her story to trip her up. Now, this isn't to say that you're going to know exactly who your character is going right into the story. What I find happens with me most of the time is I have a good idea of who my character is, I have a good idea of what she wants and what she fears, and then as I'm writing the story, Janice is going to tell me who she is, and Janice is going to tell me what her story is about. This isn't really my story. This is my character's story. And so a lot of the times I end up finding out who my character is through the process of writing her. Perhaps most importantly, I want you to ask yourself this one question. What does your character desperately want, and what are they willing to sacrifice to obtain it or to get it? Next, I want you to consider, what is it that's compelling about your character? When I think about characters, either characters that I've written or characters that I've read, what I remember mostly are their flaws. This might not be what you remember most about your characters. When you think of your favorite characters, when you think of Katniss Everdeen, Spider-Man, Goku, what's the first thing that pops into your mind? What's the first thing that you remember about these characters as you think about them right now? Let's move deeper. How many characters should you have in your story? If you're a beginning writer, I suggest that you start with a short story. 10 pages, maybe 15, less if you can. And typically, the shorter the story, the less characters. So I tend to stick to, for my very short stories, maybe 3 characters, maybe 5, but 3 is a pretty solid number. So let's say that you have a 10-page story, and you have your main character, a secondary character that's integral to the plot, and then you have another secondary character that helps move things along. If you start adding too many characters, it's too much for the reader to really remember. It tends to distract from what the story is actually about. So if you have 10 pages and you have just as many characters, why? What's the point of having so many characters in such a short space? Keep in mind that the shorter your story, the more important every little detail is. And so if you have 10, 12, 15 characters in a 10-page story, most of these characters are going to be pretty irrelevant. This may not be the case for your story. You might have a story where you have a lot of characters that are all pulling their weight. But, and I stress this especially for a beginning writer, this is typically not the case. Typically, 3 to 5 characters for a short story is a really solid number to go for. Our third tip is location. Take a tip from real estate. Location is key. When you start off having your story, a lot of the times beginning writers will have characters in mind and concepts in mind. But the world in which they're acting tends to be a bit of a blank space. And so as a reader, when I'm reading a beginning writer's story, I don't really have an idea of where they are or how the environment might come into play or affect the story. Think about Lord of the Rings, for example. Actually, let's go to The Hobbit. When Bilbo is in Mirkwood, the forest itself is an acting agent. It's not just window dressing there to give the reader a nice, pretty image while the characters are doing all the work. The actual setting itself is playing a major role in the story. Now, this doesn't have to necessarily be the case for your story, and in fact, if this is your first story, I would limit how much agency the setting has. But it just goes to show that setting is pretty important. Additionally, I want you to think about this concept. Less is more. So, you have a room, and you may have an idea of every tiny little thing that's in this room. But not everything in your mind is going to make it onto the page. So you have to pick and choose what you're going to put into your story. And these things should probably be the things that are the most important or that stand out the most. Important for the reader, important for the character. So for example, I might have a bedroom in my story, and there might be a little yellow ceramic duck on the bookshelf. But does it really matter? Now, that's not to say that every little detail has to be super important for the story. There can be details that are like just little details that make the place feel a little bit more real. But if you start putting in a whole bunch of details, so many details that it's hard for the reader to keep track of them all, then the setting sort of loses its impact. And the reader gets distracted by that quite often. So I would pick the things that matter to the story, pick the things that matter to the character, focus on them, maybe add 1 or 2 details that are just to give it a little bit more of a well-roundedness. and then leave it at that. Now, what details are needed? If I were to say that the story is taking place in a castle, that's probably going to be fine as it is. I don't really need to add a whole bunch of details to that. Pretty much everybody has the idea of what a castle looks like. You got these stone walls, nice and high, maybe a moat of water going around it. You have a couple of towers at the corners. You have some guards in knight's armor. I mean, this is pretty common for a reader to picture just from the word castle. So you may say it takes place in a castle in Ireland, in England, wherever, and then that's it. You're pretty done. And then the details that come out later are the things that are specifically important to the story. On the other hand, if I said that the story takes place in a living spaceship, well, more detail is going to be needed. What's the spaceship like? What's it look like? How big is it? Is it a thinking agent, the spaceship? Is it able to drive to fly itself? Is it able to reproduce? And a whole bunch of other little living spaceships are popping out of it. There's a lot that the reader doesn't know just by the words living spaceship. And so it's going to require a bit more detail. Keep these things in mind, and above all else, make sure that your setting is reflective of your characters. Your character should be the focus of the story. And so everything, the setting, it's all going to be revolving around your character. So keep their perspective in mind. My fourth tip is hook 'em fast. The shorter your story, the less time that you have to really grab your reader's attention. But regardless of whether or not the story is 300 words or 300 pages, your opening should make the reader lean forward in their seat. One of my favorite ways of grabbing the reader's attention is by sparking curiosity pretty early on in the story. For example, in Stephen King's The Long Walk, the opening line reads as follows. I'm just going to read it from here real quick. An old blue Ford pulled into the guarded parking lot that morning. Now, that's only the first half of the opening sentence. But, and I can't speak for you, but I know that my curiosity is piqued. I know that I'm compelled to read more. I know that I have some questions. Why is there an old blue Ford pulling into a guarded parking lot? Why is it guarded? How many guards are there? How heavily armed are they? Is it private guard? Is it military controlled? What are the consequences that are going to happen from this car pulling into the parking lot? It makes me ask the question, what happens next? My last tip for this chapter is going to be voice and point of view. Point of view often referred to as POV. Now, voice is one of those tricky things that's really hard, perhaps even impossible to teach. But I'm hoping that I can help you figure out how to build your voice. So this sort of goes back to the first step, which is to read. The more different types of stories that you read, the more different types of voices that you're going to be introduced to. And different voices have their own ways of telling stories. To really get a sense of this, pick out a few of your favorite authors, maybe Raymond Carver, Philip Roth, Stephen King. Read a few stories from one of them, then read a few stories from another one. And try to see what commonalities you find in each of the stories from the same authors. So Stephen King, for example, I'm a big Stephen King fan. What is it that Stephen King is doing in each of his stories that really helps to define the tone and atmosphere and the voice that the narrator, the speaker, is delivering to the reader? Now, do that for a few authors and you'll see there are things that set them apart and make them have their own unique voice. Now, the writing exercise that I have for you is take a story from one of your favorite authors and now write a paragraph or two trying to emulate their voice. You're not going to do this perfectly. I feel pretty confident in saying that. That's not really the point though, so don't be discouraged if you're not able to mimic Anne Rice. The important thing for you is to try on a voice, see what's working for you, what's not working for you, and then try on another voice and repeat. You're going to do this a bunch of times, dozens, and eventually you're going to pick up enough breadcrumbs for what works for your voice that you're going to be able to just sort of naturally build your own. As for POV, what perspective is the story being told in? Now, we're not going to go into great detail in this chapter, but we will in future episodes. Suffice it to say that there are two major points of view. There's first person, which is the I. So that would be where the speaker is the main character telling their own story. So, for example, it will read a lot like this. I went outside. I did this. I feel this. I'm thinking this. Third person, on the other hand, is going to be the he, she. So this is somebody telling someone else's story. So the speaker is saying, he did this, she did that, he felt this, she was betrayed. That type of narrative technique. The third option, or the third major option, would be second person point of view, and that is in the form of you. So that's telling the reader that they are the character. They're, you are doing this, you feel this, you open this door. Lovecraft does this sometimes. For a beginning writer, especially for your first story, I would not suggest doing the you. I would suggest sticking to either the first person or third person, the I or the they. But write a paragraph or two in first person or third person. See how it feels for this particular story that you're writing. And then write the same paragraph or two in the other point of view. Tom is opening the box, as opposed to I am opening the box. In both instances, it's still Tom. But in one instance, Tom is telling the story. In another instance, someone else is telling the story about Tom. Did you find this video helpful? Maybe thought of something I should have included? Leave a comment down below, along with the name of your favorite author. And make sure to check out the next video, part 2 in this video series, right here. Till next time. Bye.